Well, good morning. I did this yesterday, but I went 35 minutes long and it was on the wrong mic, so it was pretty noisy. And what's weird is I started earlier this morning, but it's noisier this morning than it was yesterday. Yesterday was a holiday, true enough. Victoria Day here in Canada. It's funny. But, just wanted to share some, I guess you could call it synergy, synchronicity, limerence, whatever you want to call it. I just finished my most recent class. It's it's course, technically. The quintessence of Trika Saivism. It's about Vimarsha. His writing about this practice. So long story short, last weekend was the final class, and then this week was the final question and answer. It was interesting because almost all of the questions, this has been weird for me because it's just been a rough couple months. So I haven't been able to really participate in the class besides watching and taking my notes. But not like there's a forum, and then he wanted questions and answers. And in the past, in these courses, I've taken part, but I wasn't able to. But this is the first of the limerence, or synergy, or kismet, whatever you want to call it. All of my questions have been answered in other people's questions and answers. One of them by example, and pardon my memory, but I'm just, I guess I could probably wait and go home and go through my notes, but one of the questions was, okay, so I understand Saivism now, so why hasn't it changed my life? And so, of course, the professor explained that it's one thing to understand the truth of the nature of self, the nature of reality, which is what Saivism's trying to get to. It's not going to change your, what would you call it, the string of karma, your karmic destiny, or whatever you want to call it, right? If you hate your job and your family's horrible to each other, understanding the true nature of reality, being Maya or partially Maya, however you want to see it, changing your relationship to reality isn't going to change, the course of events. But because the questioner asked about why hasn't my life changed, it shows that he doesn't understand the message, because Acharya Ji, the professor, was very nice in his rebuke, but he essentially said, well, you don't get it if it hasn't changed your life. It's not going to change the events of your life. What it changes is your relationship to events. I've talked about this before. Trauma is not the event, but it's the experience that you carry forward, the attachment to, the what I call trauma-informed adaptations that we carry forward that hinder our life, which was another question about forgetfulness. And he reminds the class that forgetfulness is just as much a part of memory, because without forgetfulness, we'd be attached to absolutely everything we ever experienced. Right? Traumatized in a sense. Then there's a question about why is it so much mindfulness practice has no, what I call sufficiency, doesn't actually help people. Doesn't seem to be beneficial, it just seems to be a commodity. And so he completely said absolutely. The question was mainly, it seemed like someone read McMindfulness. It's worth reading. But it gets into this idea of being mindful of what a horrible person you are isn't going to make you a better person. Without the action, right? This is why the Bhagavad Gita talks about karma. Karma as being the ultimate yoga. So he says the problem is it's been commodified. So, of course, he's looking to try to make this better. He's looking to try to share the teachings of Trika Saivism, because it's essentially the same thing. Like I've always said, trauma training, trauma prevention, trauma treatment, trauma, what would you call it? Well, trauma healing, trauma treatment, trauma contextualization. So there's other questions, but long story short, my question would have been about Vimarsha, this reflexivity, this moment that you're able to see the true nature of self and reality, right? He talked about, this was in one of his answers to one of his questions, talks about we have two relationships to reality that cause us trouble. In fact, he's mentioned Martin Buber before, and this is the same idea that Martin Buber explains. It's from the Isha Upanishad, the self in the other in the self. He talks about our two main issues with reality, with self, with our existence. He says one is the subject-object relationship. I've talked about this. This is where Vimarsha comes in, but it's also our problem with our relationship to reality. We externalize the self. Marshall McLuhan talked about this, so it's even got a Canadian component. You externalize the self to embody an object, to understand, to recognize, to cognize what it is. But this Vimarsha, this reflexivity, is when that self-object relationship returns, all of it melts away, and you have at that moment an opportunity. You have an opportunity to realize the true nature of self and reflexivity, contextualize the true nature of self and reality. I mean, there was a great question, but he didn't go into it in great detail. He used the example of dreams, and I love this professor, but he seems to be one of the few who undersell the fact that he's not going to apologize for using terms and expecting you to be a student and a thinking one at that. So he mentioned about our relationship to dreams, how we see the truth of dreams. Right? We don't see them as real as our waking, but the example I've always given is how often have you had a waking dream, or how often have you had, say, a falling dream or a dream on a roller coaster, and it can be as substantial an experience as real life. I mean, I argue I've had more intense experiences in my dreams falling or roller coasters than any roller coaster. Very few of them have truly transcended that experience. But my question is why is it that we see dreams as more tangible than, say, memories or imagination? This is why a big part of Trika practice is visualization, and I think in no small part it coincides with kasina practice, that practice I've talked about in Buddhism, where you stare at a candle and then close your eyes and try to see how closed-eyes visuals don't differ as much as the reality. Try to see through. Right? So this was our last class. This is the teaching of Vimarsha, this idea that we have an opportunity essentially constantly. He even talked about how chitta is this consciousness that's born from every sense experience, from every volition, vedana, that we attach to from moment to moment. So it's the same as this reflexivity, the Vimarsha. We have an opportunity to see the true nature of self and reality, but we tend to not pay attention. Right? I liken it to the original meaning of stupid in Latin, that you're either too stubborn to see the truth or you're too stunned. Right? Right? Are you either in a daze or are you willingly ignorant? Right? So this was the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, he had his final class talking about essentially the heart of Trika Saivism. It's a form of Tantra, not that different from Buddhism, just they believe it's important that we understand that your relationship with God should be something more than something you don't discuss. It is different from Buddhism, but it isn't in the sense that they do say that there should be some sort of guiding principle to the universe that you must understand and have a relationship with, but it doesn't have to be this concept of a God. So it can be atheist as much as we see Buddhism, but at the same time it can be as much of a say an atomized sort of God of Spinoza, of Whitman, of Emerson, a God that is the power that makes flowers grow. It doesn't have to be one that impinges on our daily lives. But so the last little bit, and I'll wrap it up. I apologize. I'm enjoying the little respite here. So I've mentioned this before. This teacher that I'm learning from is one of the foremost experts on Sanskrit, on Vedanta, on Shaivism, on some of this Tantric Buddhism, and he's even got some background in existentialism. But his close competition for expertise in this area is a gentleman who runs the New York Vedanta Society. This is non-dual Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, I don't know. His name is Swamiji Sarva Priyananda. And he's come back from a world tour. He was all over the place giving talks and opening things, I think. He's a well-known scholar. Why? Because he's an expert in Vedanta, right? Sanskrit, and I have no idea how many Indian languages, plus his English is phenomenal. It's better than mine. But not only is he essentially a PhD in Vedanta, their head guru, he also went to Harvard, so he's got a degree in Tibetan Buddhism, essentially, as I said before, Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism. And 2 weeks ago, he did an episode on what I've talked about before, the thing that I love about Tibetan Buddhism, that this same moment of clarity that we can realize, to see through to our true nature of existence and self is called the clear light of the void, or clear light insight of the void. Right, this opportunity that we have to see through, and that's what he talked about. He talked about shunya, shunyata, but essentially this emptiness, this void that is potential. Right? I've talked about Jung in his Modern Man in Search of a Soul, where he talks about modern man at the edge of a chasm, the edge of a void. Right, this potential that is shunya, shunyata, emptiness, the void. And then just this past Sunday, which we watched after my class, he did a talk on Purna, which is perfection in Vedanta. So in my particular sect, we'd call that's the eighth consciousness, being emptying of the storehouse, the alaya vijnana, right? So you're emptying these attachments to self, to achieve this purnam, this clear light void. In Sanskrit, sati sampajana. If you can remain in that state, you would essentially be a perfected consciousness. Purnam. But in Yogacara, it's called amala vijnana. Amala being perfect and vijnana being consciousness. So two of my main teachers, speaking on the exact same teachings, speaking on the synergy of these lessons, these teachings. And the reason why I love it is I've been looking at the context of Swami Vivekananda. I've told you about this fairly obscure yoga practitioner from Calcutta who came to America in 1893 for the World Congress on Religions, and he was shocked, I tell you, by how insular, how, pardon my language, but ignorant or stupid the West was. Came from Calcutta, which I've even give talks on these with, and I've had some people make jokes in the chat about, they assume Calcutta, being backwards. But the opposite was true. In Calcutta, Swamiji could hear a dozen languages being spoken, right? Or could witness a dozen faiths being practiced with devotion and confidence and commitment, right? Shraddha. He was surprised by how insular the West was, right? Knowing very little even about their own religion, in a sense. But the quote that's always rested with me, never mind the fact that I find it horrible that my choice was either I could get a PhD in comparative religions, right, or I could just get a PhD and say, like I told you, say Tibetan Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism or existentialism. I mean, I probably would have done something on Nietzsche's Eternal Return and the Chattiscoti, or Camus' absurdity, Schopenhauer, the Upanishads' influence on them all, and how, I mean, my theory is, right, the Chattiscoti and the Tetralemma definitely connected. History is now showing this. I was right about this, but what I mean is Nietzsche and Schopenhauer were writing based on what was translated, the Upanishads, and I think there may be Rig Veda. There may have been quite a bit more than that translated, but I don't think any of the tantric texts had been translated. And people don't understand this. They think Tantra as being like the sex practices, but Tantra was actually a solution to our somatic needs, right? The Kama Sutra is not about sex. Well, that, arguably. But I mean Kama Chando, our attachments, our relationship to the everyday world is what Tantric Buddhism is trying to solve. Arguably the same issues that Nietzsche was writing about in his Thus Spake Zarathustra, that Buddhism was near perfect. Schopenhauer, Jung, near perfect, save for these little issues. It's funny because I was introduced to this really early by Blavatsky and Theosophy, right? The tantric practices. Again, they were interested because of, right? They're interested in the occult and how we've twisted that, right? Remember, occult really just means something that's beyond perception, maybe something beyond our understanding. I mean, that is the Tetralemma, the Chettiscoti, or the Kettiscoti, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Because there's your limerence, your synergy, because that was even mentioned by Swamiji in New York. My Chettiscoti, my Kettiscoti, right? But forgot to mention the importance of this doubt, right? But my other Acharya didn't forget, right? He reminded us that there's doubt. This doubt is essential to faith. And I recommend Schopenhauer on this. Right? Everyone talks about will. But when you read Schopenhauer on religion, you see this exact lesson. He understood this. Right? That, sure, some people need, stories. Mythos. Stories we tell ourselves that we hold to be true, that we use to guide ourselves. But at the same time, he admits that this really needs to be as close to true as anything we hold to be true. Right? This metaphysical, what would you call it? I call it the transpersonal. I mean, it goes right back to Martin Buber, I and thou. That's all it was teaching. Right? This relationship to yourself. The Greeks know thyself. I mean, it's weird. I've been going through some of the worst stuff lately, but because of these insights, as Acharya said, he gets asked often about his experiences and try to share them tangibly. And he said, that's not really something you can do. I've talked about this, how Emerson said everyone's experience is essentially equal. It's your ability to share that to somebody in a tangible way, like they can feel it, right? But the big thing that Acharya did point out is how profound even the tiniest of these experiences are, because again, the final thought of 4 weeks of teaching from 2 of the foremost experts. I mean, I don't know, like I said, if they've run into the troubles that I did, where, I mean, I can get a doctorate of divinity, but it's going to be almost exclusively New Testament, heavily. It's really quite weird. I told you about that one gentleman who got a doctorate of divinity, and then he teaches Tibetan Buddhism. It's really quite cringe, because he is exactly what some of these people are complaining about trying to decolonize Buddhism, right? This doctor of divinity who specialized in the New Testament, pushing his Buddhism, and then he literally mentioned Christ in this one section, which, I have no problem discussing Christ if it has to do with, say, the Bodhisattva, something like that, right? Bodhicitta, right? Like Christos, but not the way he dropped it. It was full-on cringe, almost like he's propagandizing, right? Don't misunderstand. When I talk about all religions being true, it's what my Acharya told me, right? It's what Hemingway said, right? All these things are true if they're practiced, honestly. And I can't remember the exact quote of Hemingway, but the way he explains about prose should be real and, honest. And that's religion. That's faith. It's what you hold to be true, right? I've talked about this before, but arguably, if the job of a philosopher is try to modernize this stuff, which is what my professor's asking us, members of Vimarsha, to start thinking about how we can modernize these teachings without losing the sufficiency, losing not just the sacredness, but the sacredness is what Jung said was the synchronicity. Right? It's Nietzsche's Schätzen. It's what you treasure. But what you treasure must be evaluated by you, not by others. You can't be told what is valuable to you, because it's all perspectival, but it's also very dependent on your experience. Because, as the old saying goes, what was it, Seneca, or, don't quote me on who said it, but no man crosses the same river twice, because the water flows and you're not the same person you were the last step you took. And as I've said before, it always shocked me, first of all, that the temple, the museum complex that I was giving tours in, they kind of screwed up the marks of existence. There was a poster. But honestly, you want to call that a little limerence or synchronicity, because that gave me the opportunity to explain what it really was. They left out one of the aspects. And arguably you may think it was on purpose, but So impermanence, right? Suffering. But they forgot the not self, the experience of not self. Right? That's sati sampajanya. Sati, to remember these marks of existence, that everything is impermanent, that this attachment to a belief in self and a belief in permanence, and even as a yogacharan, I can tell you this belief in the nature of reality, the nature of self, the relationship between ourselves and objects, all of this is something that's meant to be questioned. The particular sect of Tantric Buddhism that I follow is essentially a modern implementation of the Socratic method. But you question everything. You question your perception, you question even the very nature of reality. But how does that even apply, right? Modernize. Well, my example is trauma and anxiety. I've told you this before. I was talking to someone I really wanted to help. It's a Buddhist book. I think it was really great because, again, I think all of these religions are true if practiced with confidence, devotion, and commitment, right? So you can follow his particular, seems to be like a Theravada noting sort of practice, and it can work just as well. And I was looking to help, but then when we started discussing, it seemed that more so than a translation into, say, French, his book needed some condensing because, I didn't read his book because it's mostly in digital format because he's not looking to profit off of it. So the publications are few and far between, physical copies. So I was lucky enough to get access to an audiobook. I was able to listen to most of the sections of the audiobook in the second edition, the revised edition. Some of it, sadly, I had to... Sorry about that. Yeah, sadly, some of it I had to actually read on the computer, and that wasn't fun. A few years ago, I was certainly awful at that. But the problem is we had a couple of get-together little meetings, but this great Buddhist practitioner seemed to get all of our meeting notes wrong, but see, what's weird is he got almost everything wrong. The day we were supposed to meet, the time, then after the stuff that we were supposed to talk about in the next meeting. He forgot, he came back and he said, oh yeah, so translate to French. And I'm like, but dude, he said he wanted me to try to condense this section that he said everyone else was having trouble condensing. So, that just went a little sideways there. I mean, I didn't really call him on that. He felt very sorry about that. And I understood, but this is that thing that I've talked about, and the last thing, I guess, about the Trika Saivism course is the professor even mentioned himself, that he said he loves to assign memorizing things like the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali to students that have no idea what it means. Right? I've told you about this. The Japanese will chant the Heart Sutra in such a way that it's not decipherable. It's not actual language. It's not Japanese. And the Chinese are the same. Even if you could, because some of it's understandable. The thing is most of them that learn it don't learn it for that reason, to understand. They actually learn it to be repeated as just a sound. And there was just a movie that's coming out based on the church's exorcist, and the same thing with the Latin rite. They feel that you don't have to know what it says for it to be beneficial, for it to be functional. Right? So this doctor that I was trying to help, after 3 meetings, him having gotten everything wrong about the times, the dates, the details. So we were just chatting instead of wasting time talking, right? And I mentioned that, I mentioned a couple of jokes I guess he didn't get. I mentioned a joke about, wizards. And just a joke that my government name means wizard in my particular language. But it also sounds like the word for wizard in another language. So I was just making that as kind of a joke because he's into magic. I thought he'd find that funny. I don't think he found it funny. Because I had mentioned something that I think he misunderstood. He said he believed in magic. And I said, no, I don't know if you're supposed to do that. And what I was getting at, and we didn't talk about, is that Carl Jung's active imagination, as example, did look into the occult, into magic and all this idea. But the idea is to leave reason aside to explore the sense of nonsense. But if you literally forego reason altogether and one walk around believing in magic, then that's not the lesson. Right? Like if you no longer can tell the difference between your fantasy and your reality, wow. Yeah, that's not how it works. So, I mean, what actually not ended, but the last time we've talked, is he completely misunderstood what I was talking about. And I mentioned that it seems that my entire raison d'être now happens to be healing trauma, solving trauma. But he's like, oh yeah, good for you. And we've never spoken again. Because if he had asked, oh, what do you mean? I would have said, if you find it, funny, then everyone gravitating to Buddhism. Buddhism itself seems to be both a treatment and a prevention for trauma. Life is inherently suffering. Trauma is guaranteed. It's our relationship to our expectations. This is Carl Christian's free energy, or Buddhism, or Saivism, or Vedanta, or Christianity. Not to burst your bubble here, but this is the same lesson. And you can look at, Matthew, Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Right? You can look at Job, right, where it resonates the same thing. Life is inherently suffering. So relationship to it that we need to change. Jean-Paul Sartre, l'enfer c'est les autres. I mean, hell is other. But only because, as I said, Sartre's the perfect example. Sartre failed at this. He treated others as me instead of an us. A we and us. That's our pronoun. Right? We do need to know ourselves. We need to individuate, as Jung likes to call it. But we can only do that in context of the other, in a community. Ecclesia, the original Greek meaning of the word that's often translated as church. Right? So, call it limerence, call it synchronicity, call it honest tattoo, call it the eternal recurrence, call it faith, call it hiding, touching. I mean, there's a million words, but depending on how you contextualize them, essentially all gets to the same meaning. I mean, enlightenment, nirvana, nirodha, moksha, samadhi. Those are just one particular set. I mean, in English, the Christian equivalent could be grace, or koinonia, or gnosis. It does it as Japanese too, but we'll try to keep it to the 35 minutes. How's that? So on that, hope you have a fabulous day, and I certainly hope. I certainly hope this is of an aid to at least one. Even the professor said that. He's going to continue to teach in the hopes that even if it guides one. Shanti, for peace.